This food is disgusting! Make it again properly!
No, you can finish dinner without me. I walked out, but what I discovered next proved they weren't after my cooking, they were after my house.
My daughter-in-law spat my food into her napkin, slammed the bowl onto my table, and ordered me to make Thanksgiving dinner again. My son lowered his eyes. So I folded my apron, picked up my keys, and walked out of my own house. They thought I was surrendering. They had no idea I was about to discover why they had been trying so hard to break me. Hello, my name is Margaret Hale. I am 63 years old, and for most of my life, I believed keeping a family together meant swallowing your own pain. That Thanksgiving, I finally learned that silence does not always protect a family. Sometimes, it only protects the person hurting it. The day began before sunrise. At 5 that morning, I stood alone in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, with a cup of coffee and my late husband's old recipe book. Outside, frost covered the grass. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, onions, and fresh sage. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. My husband, Robert, used to wake early and steal pieces of turkey skin while pretending to help. He had been gone for 4 years, but I still heard his laugh whenever I opened that recipe book. That year, I wanted everything to be perfect for our son, Daniel, and his wife, Vanessa. Daniel was 35. As a boy, he had been kind and funny. He used to bring injured birds home in shoeboxes and cry when they died. But during the 2 years since he married Vanessa, something in him had changed. He spoke more quietly. He apologized constantly. And whenever Vanessa entered a room, he watched her face before he answered any question. I noticed it, but I made excuses. Marriage is an adjustment, I told myself. They are under stress. Vanessa has a strong personality. That is what people say when the truth makes them uncomfortable. By 11, I had roasted the turkey, baked 2 pies, made cranberry sauce, glazed carrots, whipped potatoes, and prepared Robert's favorite cornbread dressing. Vanessa arrived 40 minutes late wearing a white coat and carrying nothing. She stepped into the kitchen, looked around, and wrinkled her nose. "It smells heavy in here," she said. Daniel came in behind her with 2 bottles of wine. He kissed my cheek, but the warmth vanished when Vanessa looked at him. "You said we were bringing 1 bottle," she told him. "The other one is for Mom." "Of course it is." Her words sounded harmless, but Daniel immediately put both bottles on the counter and said he was sorry. That should have troubled me more than it did. Instead, I smiled and asked them to sit down. For the first few minutes, dinner was peaceful. I carved the turkey. Daniel complimented the dressing. Vanessa moved food around her plate as if she were examining evidence. Then she tasted the sweet potatoes. Her face hardened. She grabbed her napkin, spat the bite into it, and dropped the napkin beside her plate. "What is in this?" she demanded. I thought she might have an allergy, so I answered quickly. "Sweet potatoes, butter brown sugar, cinnamon, and a little orange zest." Orange zest. Yes, Robert loved it that way. Vanessa shoved the bowl away. It hit the salt shaker and sent it rolling across the table. I specifically told Daniel I wanted a proper sweet potato casserole with marshmallows. I looked at my son. He stared at his plate. "I did not know that," I said. Vanessa leaned back in my chair and folded her arms. "Well, now you do. Make it again properly." At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. "Excuse me. You heard me. We drove all the way here. The least you can do is serve something edible." I looked at Daniel again. I waited for him to laugh object, or simply lift his eyes. He did none of those things. He whispered, "Mom, maybe it would be easier if you just made another bowl." 6 hours of work sat on that table. 4 years of grief lived in that recipe. And my only child could not even look at me while his wife treated me like a servant. Something inside me became very still. I removed my apron. I folded it and placed it beside my plate. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked. "Out." Vanessa gave a short laugh. "Margaret, do not be dramatic." I picked up my purse and keys. "The turkey is cooked," I said. "The pies are cooling. If you want different sweet potatoes, you know where the kitchen is." Then I walked out. I had no plan. I drove through quiet streets while families carried covered dishes into warm houses. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I was furious, but beneath the anger was something worse. Shame. Not because of what Vanessa had done, but because I had allowed small humiliations to grow into that moment. 3 months earlier, she had rearranged my living room without asking. A month after that, she had taken my spare house key because, as she said, someone responsible should have won. The week before Thanksgiving, she had suggested that I stop driving at night, even though my eyesight was fine. Each insult had arrived disguised as concern. I ended up at my younger sister Linda's house. She opened the door wearing slippers and holding a wooden spoon. "Margaret, what happened?" The moment she asked, I began to cry. Linda brought me inside, gave me tea, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she did not tell me to forgive them. She did not say Vanessa was probably tired. She asked one question. Why does Vanessa think she can order you around in your own home? I had no answer. My phone buzzed. It was not Daniel. It was an email from a real estate website. The subject line read, "Your Columbus property listing is almost ready." I stared at it. I had never listed my home. At first, I assumed it was junk mail. Then I saw my street address in the preview. My heart began pounding. I opened the email. There were photographs of my house, my front porch, my bedroom, Robert's study, even the inside of my garage. The listing was marked, "Coming soon." The suggested asking price was $485,000. At the bottom, the contact name was Vanessa Hale. Linda read over my shoulder and went pale. I called the realtor, whose number appeared in the email. A man named Scott answered. I told him I owned the property and had never agreed to sell it. There was a long pause. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "your daughter-in-law told me she had your authorization. She said you were moving into assisted living after the holidays." "I am not moving anywhere." Another pause. Then he said something I will never forget. "She also said your son had power of attorney because you were beginning to experience memory problems." I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers hurt. I had no memory problems. I had never signed a power of attorney. Scott apologized and promised to freeze the listing immediately. He also agreed to send me copies of every document Vanessa had submitted. 5 minutes later, they arrived. There was a letter claiming Daniel could make financial decisions for me. There was a form with a signature that looked almost like mine. And there was a note describing me as confused, emotionally unstable, and unable to maintain the property. That explained the photographs. Vanessa had taken them with my spare key. It also explained the months of comments about my age, my driving, and my supposed forgetfulness. She had not been concerned about me. She had been building a story. The Thanksgiving insult was not just cruelty. It was bait. If I yelled, threw them out, or appeared hysterical, she could describe me as unstable. If I obeyed her, she would prove I could be controlled. Either way, she believed she would win. Then my bank called. The fraud department wanted to verify an online request for a home equity line of credit worth $150,000. I had made no such request. The application had been submitted less than an hour earlier. While I was sitting at Linda's table, Vanessa was in my house trying to borrow money against it. I told the bank to freeze everything and flag my accounts. Then I called an attorney named Evelyn Ross, a woman Linda knew from church. Evelyn listened, asked me to forward the documents, and told me not to contact Daniel or Vanessa yet. "Do not warn them," she said. "Let them believe you know nothing." For the first time that day, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt focused. Evelyn met us at her office that evening. She examined the forms and quickly found errors. The notary number did not exist. The signature date was a day when I had been visiting Linda in Cincinnati. The forged document gave Daniel broad control over my finances, but Daniel's signature appeared only on one page. I wanted to believe he knew nothing. Then Evelyn opened an attachment from the bank. It included a copy of Daniel's driver's license. My son was involved. I felt as if the floor had disappeared. Vanessa had been cruel to me, but Daniel was my child. I had stayed awake beside him through fevers. I had worked 2 jobs to help pay for college. After Robert died, Daniel held a funeral and promised I would never be alone. Now he was helping his wife steal my home. "Why?" I whispered. Evelyn pointed to the credit application. The money was supposed to be deposited into an account belonging to VDH Lifestyle Group. Vanessa's initials. Over the next 2 days, we learned the rest. Vanessa's online clothing business was failing. She owed suppliers more than the $90,000. She and Daniel also had credit card debt, a second mortgage, and unpaid taxes. They had planned to borrow against my house, use part of the money to cover their debts, then sell the property in the spring. According to messages later recovered from Daniel's tablet, Vanessa planned to move me into an inexpensive care facility outside the city. She called it the cleanest solution. A Daniel had replied, "She will never agree." A Vanessa answered, "Then we make everyone believe she cannot decide." The message that hurt most came next. Daniel wrote, "Give me until Thanksgiving." He had chosen a deadline for betraying his own mother. I returned home late Thanksgiving night with Linda and a police officer. Daniel and Vanessa were gone. Dirty plates covered the table. Half the turkey had been wrapped and taken. Red wine stained Robert's tablecloth. On the kitchen counter, beneath my folded apron, I found a brochure for Green Meadows Assisted Living. Vanessa had circled the least expensive room. I did not cry. I took photographs of everything. Then I changed the locks. The next morning, Daniel called 17 times. I did not answer. Vanessa sent a message saying I had embarrassed her and owed her an apology. At noon, she sent another. "We need to discuss your living situation when you are calmer." I forwarded it to Evelyn. On Monday, we went to the police with the forged documents, bank records, listing agreement, and messages. The detective took the case seriously, especially because Vanessa had attempted to obtain money using false authorization. But I was not finished. For years, I had kept a secret from Daniel, not to manipulate him, but to protect his future. Robert and I had created a family trust containing our house, investments, and a small commercial building. Daniel was supposed to inherit most of it after my death. The trust included one important condition: any beneficiary who tried to exploit, defraud, or force another beneficiary into surrendering property could be removed. Robert had insisted on that clause because his own brother had cheated their mother late in her life. At the time, I thought it was unnecessary. Now it felt like Robert had reached across 4 years to protect me. Evelyn scheduled a meeting for the following Friday. She told Daniel and Vanessa we were prepared to discuss the house privately before taking further action. They arrived expecting negotiation. Vanessa wore a gray suit and carried a leather folder. Daniel looked as if he had not slept. I sat across from them in Evelyn's conference room. A small recorder rested on the table. Vanessa began immediately. "Margaret, everyone is concerned about your behavior. Walking out on Thanksgiving was irrational." I said nothing. She opened her folder. "Daniel and I are willing to overlook it, but we need cooperation. The house is too much for you. If you sign these papers, we can manage the sale and find you somewhere safe." She slid a document toward me. It granted Daniel control over my property. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Vanessa smiled. "Then we may need a court to decide whether you are capable of making responsible choices." My son flinched but stayed silent. I looked directly at him. "Daniel, is that what you want?" His lips parted. For 1 second, I saw the boy who used to bring home injured birds. Then Vanessa placed her hand on his arm. He lowered his eyes again. "It is for the best, Mom," he whispered. That was the moment I let him go. I pushed the unsigned papers back. Evelyn entered the room with the detective. Vanessa's smile vanished. Evelyn placed copies of the forged authorization, fraudulent loan application, property listing, and recovered messages on the table one by one. "Mrs. Hale will not be signing anything," she said, "but both of you will have several opportunities to sign documents in the near future." Vanessa stood so quickly her chair struck the wall. "This is a misunderstanding." The detective asked her to sit down. Daniel began crying. He looked at me and said, "Mom, I am sorry. I never thought it would go this far." "You gave her your license," I said. "You signed the application. You chose Thanksgiving as my deadline." She said we would pay it back with money from selling my home. He had no answer. Vanessa blamed Daniel. Daniel blamed Vanessa. Within minutes, the marriage they had protected at my expense became a battlefield. The detective escorted them out separately. The criminal case took months. Vanessa eventually pleaded guilty to attempted financial exploitation, forgery, and fraud-related charges. Daniel accepted a plea agreement for his role in submitting false financial documents. Neither went to prison for long, but both received probation, restitution orders, and permanent records that followed them into every job application and loan request. Vanessa's business collapsed. Her professional partners left. She and Daniel sold their own house to pay legal fees and debts. But the consequence they never expected came from the trust. Using the protection clause Robert had written, I removed Daniel as a beneficiary. The commercial building and most of the investments will now fund a nonprofit that helps older adults obtain legal assistance when relatives try to exploit them. Daniel learned about the change through Evelyn. He came to my house one rainy afternoon 6 months later. He stood on the porch where I used to photograph him on the first day of school. He looked thinner and older. "Did you really take me out of the trust?" he asked. "Les, I am still your son." "You are," I said. "But being my son gave you my love. It did not give you my house, my money, or the right to erase me." He cried and asked if I would ever forgive him. I told him forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Forgiveness might come someday. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, without a reward waiting at the end. Then he asked if he could come inside. I said no. That was not revenge. It was a boundary, and I wish I had learned the difference sooner. The following Thanksgiving, I woke before sunrise again. I opened Robert's recipe book and made the same sweet potatoes, with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, and orange zest. But I did not cook for people who measured my value by what they could take from me. I invited Linda, Evelyn, 2 widows from my neighborhood, and a woman named Grace whom I met through the Elder Justice nonprofit. Grace's grandson had stolen her savings, and she was rebuilding her life at 71. We filled my dining room with laughter. No one criticized the food. No one ordered me back into the kitchen. No one lowered their eyes while someone else humiliated me. Before dinner, I placed Robert's photograph beside the recipe book. For a moment, grief tightened my throat. Then Linda raised her glass. "To Margaret," she said, who finally remembered that this is her house. I smiled and looked around the table. My house had nearly been stolen, but what I recovered was far more valuable. I recovered my judgment, my voice, my right to decide who could sit at my table. Vanessa once ordered me to make Thanksgiving dinner again properly. So I did. 1 year later, for people who understood that love is not served through fear. And when I folded my apron that night, I did not walk away from my family. I walked back to myself.